Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Office of Procurement Regulations webinar on developing special handbooks and guidelines. I am Tamara Roy, Head Corporate Communications, and we're extremely pleased that you are able to participate in today's session. At this time, we recognize our Chairman and Procurement Regulator, Mr. Monilal Lalchan. While he will not officiate today, he is available to take any questions that you may have at the end of this session. Led by Ms. Pastora Brown, Head Procurement Policy Department. The team who will be presenting today will be Head Property Disposal, Mrs. Joy Joseph-Lara, Policy Officer, Ms. Devika Singh, and Senior Capacity Development Specialist, Ms. Melissa Ramkumarsingh, and Administrative Officer, Mrs. Camille Andrews. Before we begin the formal aspects of today's proceedings, please allow me to go through some helpful tips for a successful session. Please note that your mics will be muted. Your questions during the session can be sent either via the chat option or through the Slido link that will be placed in the chat on the Teams platform. These questions will be collated by our team and addressed in our question and answer segment at the end of the session. Please remember to keep your contributions helpful and be considerate to our presenters and other participants. At the end of today's session, you will be invited to provide your feedback. Feel free to help us improve future sessions to better match your needs by letting us know what worked well and what did not. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be shared via email and uploaded to our website. So without further delay, please join me in inviting Ms. Pastora Brown, who will give you an introduction into today's webinar. Pastora.
Thank you, Tamara. Good morning to all attendees of this morning's webinar. We are very glad that you are able to join us today. You would be aware that the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act 2015 as amended provides for public bodies to develop special handbooks and guidelines to govern their procurement, retention, and disposal of public property functions. Over the last 2 years or so, public bodies would either have formally advised that they will simply adopt all of the handbooks and guidelines issued by the OPR as their own, or some have submitted draft handbooks and guidelines for approval by the OPR. As we would have been reiterating, Section 13(1)(e) of the Act, which mandates the office to approve public bodies' special handbooks and guidelines, has not yet been proclaimed. Accordingly, the OPR has not been able to approve the documents that were submitted. Notwithstanding, we wish to thank the various public bodies for their proactive approach and their willingness and eagerness to embrace the new public procurement legal, regulatory, and operational frameworks. As we collectively eagerly anticipate the passage of the procurement regulations and the subsequent full proclamation of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, we thought it prudent to host a webinar to provide additional guidance to all public bodies as it relates to the handbooks and guidelines that will support the achievement of the objects of the Act. It is our hope that the information provided during this morning's session will be used by public bodies to determine the approach they wish to take in respect of the handbooks and guidelines. For public bodies who have already prepared and submitted their drafts for review by the office, we trust that you will use the information we share with you this morning to conduct your own internal review of your drafts and make any necessary adjustments as may be applicable. Thereafter, as promised, upon either further or full proclamation of the Act, the OPR will embark upon a review and approval process for any special handbooks and guidelines submitted by public bodies. This morning's presentation will proceed as follows. First, we will examine the context within which the handbooks and guidelines are being developed from an international, regional, and local perspective. Next, we will explore the differences in the philosophical and operational approaches between the existing and the forthcoming public procurement, retention, and disposal of public property regimes. Following which, we will review the legislative clauses that provide the authority for the OPR to issue general guidelines and approve public bodies' special guidelines. We will then review the handbooks and guidelines that have already been issued or that are currently being issued by the OPR and discuss the three options that public bodies may consider as it relates to the handbooks and guidelines. Finally, we will provide some pointers for your consideration in the development of your special handbooks and guidelines. Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for taking the time to be present and to participate in today's webinar, and trust that you will find the information we share with you this morning to be interesting, enlightening, and useful. As we always do, we will post both the presentation and the recording of today's webinar on the OPR's website so that the information and guidance can be available to you at your convenience. We remind you that you are always welcome to contact us if you require any further clarification or assistance. I would now like to hand you over to Ms. Tamara Roy for the next segment of today's proceedings.
Thank you, Pastora. So, according to the agenda, we will now head into our engagement session, where we open up with a few questions that we have for you to answer. So to do this, we invite Mrs. Camille Andrews and again Pastora to participate, to guide you through this session.
A pleasant good morning again to all public bodies. At this time, I invite you to click on the link that is in the chat to answer only 3 questions. Please indicate in the chat if you have gotten access to Slido, which is where the questions are located. Governments procure goods, works, and services. Answers coming in.
Excellent. So we are seeing to ensure efficient functioning of their various departments, day-to-day operations, better efficiently serve stakeholders, proper running of the country, government procure goods, works, and service for the continued operation of government bodies. All very excellent responses. And to that, we may add, governments procure goods, works, and services to ensure that they have the necessary infrastructure, systems, tools, and so forth to develop the country and provide for the needs of citizens. For example, the procurement of office stationery and supplies or computers and printers would ensure that public officers are equipped to perform their duties, or the outcome of procurement of, let's say, construction supervision services would be to ensure that citizens have high quality roads, hospitals, and community centers to provide for their transportation, medical, and social needs. Excellent responses we see on the screen there.
Okay, thank you everyone. The next question is, what are some of the risks involved in public procurement?
Again, very well done. We have fraud, unethical sourcing, lack of transparency, integrity breaches, procurement of defective goods or ineffective services, poor quality, no value for money, incorrect goods and services, mismanagement, etc., etc. And again, we could look at the risks. We can actually group them. So we may have supply risks, and that is that you will not have the necessary goods, works, or services available to you at the time that you may need them. Financial risks could be that you will not be able to pay your suppliers or contractors in accordance with the terms and conditions that were set out in the contract or the purchase order. We have risks, of course, as you have on the screen there, of not achieving government policy outcomes, and these would include value for money, local industry development, or even transparency, integrity, or public confidence. Very well done.
Okay, and our final question is, what are some of the risks involved in the retention and disposal of public property?
Two parts to it. So you can put, for example, in your response, retention dash, and what are the risks you see for retention, and then you may put disposal dash and the risk that you see for disposal. Retention dash risk, disposal dash risk.
So we see we have some beautiful responses so far for retention, lack of resources to maintain same. Disposal, we are seeing one for value for money, inaccurate valuation, lack of transparency on approved disposal. For disposal, inequitable sale of gifting of items earmarked for disposal. Retention, that availability of finances, skills, and lack of labor to conduct activities, poor planning. Storage, bias, selection of personnel for disposal, environmental hazards. And just to name some others, for personal property, some risks involved include theft, destruction by fire, negligence, misuse, wastage, loss of ownership or control. We can also look at risk involving intangible property. There are cyber risks, brand impersonators, and so on. And in terms of real property, for retention, there could be the risk of deterioration, underdevelopment, mismanaged lease arrangements, lack of real estate management. And now we can look at some risk involved in disposal of personal public property, and these will include undervalued items, government interference, management influence, employees' preference, further damage to items from mishandling or movement. Thank you very much for your responses.
Okay, at this time we will hand over to Ms. Brown.
All right, so now we're going to go into setting the context for developing handbooks and guidelines. Ms. Pastora Brown will take you through this session.
Okay, so before we actually look at the approaches we could take to developing our handbooks and guidelines, let us first examine the context that caused the requirements for the development of the handbooks and guidelines. You may find that the information provided in this section may be just a little bit heavy, so I am asking that you please listen carefully and feel free to visit the OPR's website to listen to the recording again to ensure that you capture all of the information being shared. In this section of the presentation, we will examine The importance of public procurement from a global perspective, the Trinidad and Tobago journey over the last 40 years for public procurement, retention, and disposal of public property reform, the new philosophical approaches that are being introduced by the new Act, as well as some of the operational changes that are required to bring about the paradigm shift from the old to the new system for procurement, retention, and disposal of public property in Trinidad and Tobago. So first, we want to look at the importance of getting procurement right from a global perspective. So we can ask the question, why is the issue of public procurement, retention, and disposal of public property so important that it has to be legislated? Well, aside from the fact that public officers are accountable to the Parliament and to the citizens for the public funds that they spend, the number one reason we will look at today is simply because government is a big spender. Studies have shown that globally an estimated 12% of GDP is spent on the procurement of goods, works, and services annually. The World Bank estimates Trinidad and Tobago's GDP for 2020 as US 21.53 billion. So that translates to approximately 150 billion TT dollars. 12% of that figure would be equal to 18 billion TT dollars, which is roughly 32% of the annual budget. And we can all agree that this is a huge chunk of public funds. Without adequate legislation and procedural controls in place, access to that kind of money can unfortunately lead to corrupt practices such as bribery, overspending for poor quality goods, works, and services, bid rigging, and overall misappropriation of funds. The next reason we want to look at has to do with corruption. In its 2014 Foreign Bribery Report, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development confirmed that public procurement is one of the government's activities that is most vulnerable to corruption. Their study showed that between 10 and 30% of expenditure on construction projects alone is lost through corrupt practices on an annual basis. If we estimate that in the Trinidad and Tobago context, this amount translates to approximately 5 million TT per year, think for a moment about what that $5 million can do for Trinidad and Tobago in terms of our development and the quality of services that you as public bodies provide for the citizens of the country. $5 billion, my apologies. I'll read that again just to reinforce the point. If we estimate that in the Trinidad and Tobago context, this amount translates to TT $5 billion each year, think for a moment about what that $5 billion can do for Trinidad and Tobago in terms of our development and the quality of services that you as public bodies provide for the citizens of the country. On the flip side, end users have a responsibility to care for and maintain public assets. Savings can be accrued from proper retention and disposal of public property, since maintenance of the assets, such as equipment, buildings, and infrastructure, can extend their useful life and/or enhance their value and worth, so that when the time comes for disposal, the public body will be able to obtain the highest possible value. And based on the responses that we would have seen on the screen, I know that I'm preaching to the converted. So the third reason has to do with the Trinidad and Tobago standing in the international community. In addition to the national benefits that can be derived from good procurement and related practices, we also need to consider that Trinidad and Tobago is a signatory to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. So, how does the UNCAC fit into the scheme of things? Well, the UNCAC is the only legally binding international anti-corruption treaty and is described as a global response to a global problem. The UNCAC has developed, among other things, preventive policies in the fight against corruption, which include transparent procurement and sound financial management. It should be noted, therefore, that the United National Commission on International Trade Law, which we commonly refer to as the UNCITRAL Model Law for Public Procurement, from which a number of the provisions of our own Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act were drawn, was revised in 2011 to support the implementation of the provisions of the UNCAC. These provisions include publication of information related to procurement procedures and contracts, so you can already see that the OPR is on the right track with the database that we would have developed, and allowing sufficient time. And again, if you look at the draft regulations, you will see there's provision made for sufficient time for suppliers and contractors to prepare and submit their tenders. Publication of tendering rules. So no longer will our tendering rules be a secret, but they are published, for example, on the OPR's website, and you will also publish yours on your website, as well as predetermined selection and award criteria. Also provides for an effective system for challenge proceedings. And again, you would be familiar with the act that speaks of challenge proceedings, and you would be familiar as well with some of the initiatives that the office has already taken in that regard, getting ready for full proclamation. Also provides for proper safeguards for public procurement personnel, including declarations of interest, screening procedures, and training requirements. And again, recently you would have been participating in the rollout of the office's certification and training requirements. And all of these requirements are in keeping with international best practice. So let us take a quick look now at where Trinidad and Tobago falls on the Global Corruption Perception Index. The line graph that you would see on the screen, sort of moving from red to yellow in color, we will see there that highly corrupt nations score close to 0, while the nations that are perceived as being less corrupt in their public sector practices score closer to the 100 mark. So 0 is the darker red part, and the yellower part takes us up to 100. As we can see from the bar graph, just above that little scale there, Trinidad and Tobago's scores trend below the halfway mark consistently from 2010 onwards. For 2020, the Trinidad and Tobago ranked as being perceived as the 86th out of 180 countries of the world, with a score of 40 out of 100. So we can ask ourselves a couple of questions here. Number one, can we do better? And number 2, how can our practices under the new public procurement regime for the procurement of goods, works, and services, and for the retention and disposal of public property help in improving our CPI score and our ranking in the global community? So let us quickly now take a review of Trinidad and Tobago's journey towards reform of the public procurement, retention, and disposal of public property regime. In 1961, the Central Tenders Board Act was established. It was a simpler time with a small number of government organizations. The CTB was established as the sole entity responsible for government procurement. As time went by, the external environment changed, impacting the internal environment, that is the public service. In order to effect procurement over time, the CTB Act had to be amended several times, and statutory bodies and state enterprises were developed. In 1997, a legislative proposal was made to, and I quote, repeal and replace the Central Tenders Board Act, close and open quotes, and to provide for the establishment of a National Tenders Board for the government of Trinidad and Tobago and certain statutory bodies, and for the establishment of a parliamentary commission to monitor the activities of the board, that's the Central Tenders Board. This bill did not progress, and in 2011, the most recent guidelines for procurement and disposal of public property by the state sector was published by the Ministry of Finance as Appendix B of its monitoring manual. In the interim, in 2005, the white paper on procurement reform identified a number of weaknesses and limitations with the Trinidad and Tobago procurement regime, including the fact that the remit of the CTB Act was limited to the tendering phase of the procurement cycle, with no provision for oversight of the pre-tender stage and the post-award of contract stage. The issue of parallel procurement systems within the public sector was also of concern. It was also identified that some public bodies were bypassing the CTB to circumvent its procurement processes. All of this was compounded by the fact that there was an insufficient number of human resources available to effectively monitor the procurement function. In 2010, a joint select committee was appointed to consider legislative proposals for the proposed public procurement reform that was set out in the white paper. In 2015, as we would all know, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act of 2015 was assented to, and the sections of the Act relating to the establishment of the Office of Procurement Regulation were proclaimed. Between 2015 and 2017, aided by a consultative process, the UNDP drafted a handbook for public procurement and special guidelines for specific sectors, including the health sector and state-owned enterprises, and conducted capacity building sessions for public service officers. In 2018, the procurement regulator and board members of the Office of Procurement Regulation were appointed by the President of the Republic, and they immediately set to work on the establishment of the Office of Procurement Regulation. To date, pursuant to its mandate, as set out in the partially proclaimed Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, the OPR has, among other things, developed regulations for the procurement, retention, and disposal of public property, developed and published on its website over 41 handbooks, guidelines, procedural forms, and contracts, developed a procurement depository for supplier and contractor registration and pre-qualification, and a database in which public bodies can seamlessly report on their procurement activities. The OPR has also hosted and facilitated a number of stakeholder engagements and public consultations with both public and private sector organizations throughout Trinidad and Tobago, including ministry personnel, statutory bodies, state enterprises, the Tobago House of Assembly, the regional health authorities, regional corporations, non-governmental organizations, chambers of commerce, the Manufacturers Association of Trinidad and Tobago, the Contractors Association, and the Institute of Internal Auditors, among others. Most recently, on July 2nd, 2021, the draft regulations were laid in Parliament by the Honourable Minister of Finance. Once the regulations are passed in the Parliament and Senate, the next step in the journey is expected to be either further proclamation or full proclamation, leading to the implementation of the new Act. You would be well aware of some of the features of the new system of public procurement, retention, and disposal of public property, which are as follows. It incorporates procurement, retention, and disposal of public property. So it's no longer just procurement. So you would recognize, I keep repeating as well, retention and disposal of public property, both real public property and personal public property. It provides for the establishment of an independent Office of Public Procurement Regulation that is reportable only to the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. It mandates the appointment of a procurement officer within every public body who must be identified to the Office of Procurement Regulation and who is charged with the responsibility for procurement and disposal of public property for that public body. So we have no more Central Tenders Board once we have the full proclamation. The objects of the Act are to promote a number of good governance and socially responsible principles, paving the way for public bodies to adopt a principle-based approach that includes the use of risk-based analyses to ensure that the objects of the Act are achieved. It provides for a greater degree of transparency and accountability, supported by a number of tools, systems, and procedures, including the Procurement Depository, published listing of pre-qualified contractors and suppliers, as well as ineligible suppliers and contractors, the development of the annual procurement plan, property disposal planning and strategy development, the annual schedule of planned procurement activities, the annual procurement performance report, publication of contract awards and framework agreements, standstill period, challenge proceedings, etc. Accordingly, any special handbook or guideline developed by a public body must demonstrate at a minimum the relevance and application of the features and so forth discussed here today. As you would also be aware, public procurement reform is not a Trinidad and Tobago phenomenon. Public procurement reform is carried out globally as a result of changes both in the internal and external environments. Example, globalization means that goods, works, and services can be relatively easily available from the international marketplace. In addition, the United Nations Development Goals include matters such as sustainable development, which impacts on procurement, retention, and disposal of public property. Countries the world over are seeking to protect and develop their national economies. Procurement laws are therefore being amended worldwide to provide for local industry development and the inclusion of local content in the procurement of goods, works, and services. Advances in technology affect the way in which business is conducted and promotes transparency, which can lead to better decision making. Of note, the new procurement legislation, Section 13(1)(k), mandates the Office of Procurement Regulation to determine, develop, introduce, maintain, and update related system-wide databases and technology, as well as to promote electronic transactions and to promote technology in public procurement, retention, and disposal of public property. Interestingly, the UNCITRAL Model Law on Procurement, which guides developing nations in the development of their procurement legislation, was revised in 2011 to facilitate the implementation of the procurement-related requirements of the, as we looked at earlier, United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Just last year, in 2010, the IDB, with which most of us would be familiar, updated its procurement policies to, and I quote, incorporate modern procurement methods and procedures that enable mainstreaming of innovation and technological advances, tailored to clients' needs, and to expand the concept of value for money, while maintaining high standards of integrity and transparency, end quote. So internationally, India, Brazil, and Australia would have made amendments to their public procurement systems in 2017, 2021, and 2021, respectively. While regionally, Bermuda, Jamaica, and Guyana amended their legislation in 2017, 2018, 2019, so very recently. So the question is, in the Trinidad and Tobago context, what does procurement reform entail from a practical perspective? Is it going to be the same old with a few patches stuck on here and there? In developing your special handbooks and guidelines, is it sufficient to change a few words and phrases in your existing tenders rules, or does the paradigm shift require a bit more than that? To answer these questions, let us now explore some of the philosophical approaches that will support the achievement of the objects of the new Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act. Under the existing legal framework, government's policy objectives can be said to be implicit in the regulations governing public procurement and disposal transactions. This is described as the prescriptive approach, and this is the manner in which the CTB Act and older public procurement regulations worldwide would have been developed. Under the old regime, there is no opportunity to consider whether or not the rules are fit for purpose. just tick the appropriate procedural boxes, and the expectation is that you would be achieving the desired outcome in terms of transparency, accountability, value for money, and so on. The modern approach to public procurement and disposal of public property, however, explicitly expresses government's policy objectives in the primary legislation, which is the Act, which today include, among other things, local industry development, sustainable procurement, and disposal of public property, as well as sustainable environment. Continuing with policy objectives, the old approach fosters an environment where public officers are taught that by rigidly complying with a set of procurement procedures, they will achieve, for example, best value for money. So we have come to believe that all bidders must provide 3 years audited financial statements. So what do? We invite bids for, let us say, a low risk, relatively low value item, like maybe 3 laptops. And we proceed to disqualify bidders who are unable to produce audited financial statements to supply 3 laptops. Similarly, for disposal of public property, the old approach was to dispose as and when required or as a matter of urgency, focus most times on just one method of disposal. The new approach, which is based on a principle rather than a prescriptive model, allows the public body to develop strategies, policies and procedures, systems and practices that are suitable for the various categories of procurement and disposal. So, as it pertains to the procurement of our 3 laptops, the public body can ask itself, how do I mitigate the risk of the supplier not having the financial capability to perform the contract? Do I really require 3 years audited financial statements? Or should I ask for management accounts instead, or maybe a banker's letter, demonstrating that the potential supplier is a bona fide customer with good relations and his bankers will suffice? Let's look now at the procurement actions. As far as procurement procedures go, utilizing the old approach, it is expected that one-size-fits-all methodology will work for every procurement transaction. The new approach provides the public body with the opportunity to analyze its procurement portfolio, and you will remember that you would have undertaken this exercise when you prepared your annual procurement plans and submitted them for review by the office last year. You would have taken into consideration a number of factors, including the needs of your organization, the nature and characteristics of the goods, works, and services that you require, the estimated contract amount for each of those, the way in which you as the public body is viewed by the supply market, as well as the manner in which the supply market operates. So now you are utilizing a risk-based approach by analyzing the information before you to determine the appropriate procurement methods and procedures for each round of procurement. So let's look now at supply markets. Simply put, if you want to encourage competition in the supply market, the public body has to understand how the supply market operates. So let us again use the example of our 3 years audited financial statements for the procurement of the relatively low risk, low value category of items. When requirements are placed on bidders that are too much for them to bear, they will, over time and tell me if this does not sound familiar, refuse to participate in procurement proceedings, and ultimately fewer bidders will result in less competition, which will eventually result in poorer quality goods and services and the achievement of overall less value for money. The old approach operates under the misconception that there are many suppliers in the marketplace who wish to compete with each other to win government contracts. If you have ever invited bids and received only a small handful or one or even zero responses, you will know that that assumption does not necessarily hold true. The new approach takes into consideration that supply markets vary for a number of reasons, including the number of suppliers in the marketplace, the value of the supply contract, as well as the attractiveness of doing business with the purchaser. Armed with this knowledge, the public body is able to develop the most appropriate strategy to engage the supply market to ensure that it receives, among other things, best value for money. Similarly, for disposal, the demand market determines the competing markets or individuals with interest in the items earmarked for disposal. An examination of the demand market and the interest of key stakeholders would assist the public body in developing the most appropriate disposal strategy for achieving the objects of the Act, including promoting value for money. Let's now look at stakeholder influences. Again, the old approach wants us to believe that as long as we check all the boxes in the existing procurement procedures, we will achieve the policy objectives of value for money, no matter what the various stakeholders, including our internal customers, the suppliers and contractors, or the general population may think. The modern day approach to public procurement includes identifying supply risk and taking measures to mitigate those risks, identifying the key stakeholders, their needs, interests, and their ability to influence procurement outcomes, and putting the appropriate strategies in place to manage their influences. If you take a look at the OPR's website, you will see a procedural form entitled Procurement Strategy Development Form, where this type of information can be documented for each procurement activity to assist the public body in the development of the most appropriate strategy for achieving the desired outcomes for its procurement. Within the handbook, again on the OPR website, that is entitled Retention and Disposal of Public Property, you will find a form entitled Disposal Strategy Development Form, which can be used for capturing, again, critical market information and assisting you, the public body, in achieving the objects of the Act. The last philosophical approach we want to look at has to do with the treatment of the public body's procurement portfolio. Under the existing regime, it is thought that an important metric is the number of individual procurement transactions performed by the procuring entity. A different approach is taken under, of course, the new regime, where the level of procurement effort is represented by all of the categories of goods, works, and services that are being procured. So we are moving from ad hoc procurement activities, where every Monday morning new procurement items are urgently identified, towards strategic procurement, where the entire portfolio is examined on an annual basis, allowing for proper planning to take place. Similarly, for disposal of public property, we are moving towards strategically well-planned disposal strategies in order to achieve the best outcome from the disposal process. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your kind patience. I will now hand you over to Ms. Melissa Ramkumarsingh, who will take us through the next segment of the presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Good morning, everyone. When developing handbooks and guidelines, public bodies must have a good understanding of the modern-day approach to procurement, retention, and disposal of public property and how it differs from the traditional approach. In a nutshell, the paradigm shift upon which we are embarking contains a number of new approaches. For instance, the philosophical approaches that were introduced under the new regime embodies good governance principles and are consistent with a modern approach to public procurement management. The organization structure for procurement and disposal within public bodies must be appropriately structured and resourced to cater for, among other things, a named procurement officer and, where applicable, a procurement department. Additionally, public bodies must have stores and inventory staff, a disposal committee, and a procurement and disposal advisory committee. The paradigm shift also moves procurement and disposal of public property transactions from being solely focused on price, for example, procedures linked only to financial delegation of authority, to now include consideration of the supply and disposal markets. It moves away from operational or transactional approaches that are ad hoc or amorphous to ones that include strategic planning, monitoring, control, analyzing, reporting, and continuous improvement. The requirement for the preparation of the annual procurement plan is an example of this shift. The paradigm shift also provides a greater degree of transparency and accountability through strategies such as effective record keeping and challenge proceedings. In the next few slides, we will examine the practical changes to public procurement, retention, and the disposal of public property that resulted from the shift in the procurement regime. With the introduction of the new regime, public bodies who currently execute public procurement and disposal actions in compliance with either the CTB Act or the Standard Procurement Procedures outlined in Appendix B of the State Enterprises Performance Monitoring Manual must now comply with the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act. In the old regime, the focus was mainly on the tendering and evaluation and award stages of the procurement process. With the new system, there is now a broader focus on all 4 stages of procurement proceedings, namely the planning stage, tendering, the evaluation and award stage, and contract management to close out. This brings to the forefront the value that all stages of the procurement process that can add to the achievement of organizational and procurement objectives. Additionally, while both systems cover the disposal of public property, there is now additional focus in the new regime on the retention of public property. This shift highlights the key role of retention in ensuring that performance and value are maximized. In the CTB legislation, the procurement principles were not explicitly stated. The focus under this system was on the application of prescribed procedures with the expectation that once the procedures outlined are followed, the principles would be attained. Under the new system, however, there is a clear focus on achieving the objects of the Act. These objects are clearly stated in Section 5 of the Act, and we all know them by now. They are the principles of accountability, integrity, transparency, value for money, efficiency, fairness, equity, public confidence, local industry development, sustainable procurement and disposal, and sustainable development. Under the old system, the levels of responsibility for procurement were fragmented. For instance, in state agencies, responsibility for procurement is held by the Board of Directors. However, the board may delegate some of this responsibility to the Tenders Committee and the CEO or designate. Similarly, in ministries and departments under the ambit of the Central Tenders Board Act, assignment of procurement responsibility depends on the estimated value of the activity and lies either with the Central Tenders Board, the Ministerial Tenders Committee, or permanent secretaries. Under the new system, the accounting officer retains fiduciary responsibility for the public body in accordance with the financial regulations of the Exchequer and Audit Act, Sections 4 and 5. While Section 61(2) of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act places responsibility for procurement and disposal of public property of a public body firmly under the purview of the named procurement officer. Additionally, the Board of Directors and the Audit Committee of the Board, in their governance and oversight roles, may provide non-objection and advice, but should not play a role in the evaluation and award process. The introduction of the new regime marks a shift from a system of ad hoc procurement and disposal activities where there is limited planning of the procurement requirements and where procurement and disposal are treated as individual administrative tasks, to a new system where procurement planning plays a key role at both the strategic and operational levels. For instance, at the strategic level, the entire portfolio of procurement is examined to ensure alignment with the public body's strategic objectives, whilst at the operational level, planning ensures that the most suitable procurement or disposal strategies are applied to achieve the best overall outcome. There is also a shift away from the old system where a limited list of procurement methods were available for use to the new regime where an extended list of procurement methods are available to select from. This allows public bodies to select the most appropriate procurement method given consideration to the circumstances of the requirement. However, clear justification must be provided in the record of procurement proceedings for the method selected. Similar to procurement, when disposing of public property, we are also moving away from focusing on limited disposal methods to considering all possible methods of disposal, weighing the pros and cons, and analyzing each before deciding on the most feasible method that best suits the items being targeted for disposal. The paradigm shift also moves procurement from being solely focused on estimated price to considering market conditions. This modern approach requires public bodies to select the most appropriate procurement strategy considering the circumstances of the specific requirements, such as the estimated contract price, supply risks associated with the acquisition, the nature of the market, the organizational objectives and challenges in acquiring the goods. Additionally, when determining the disposal value, we consider not only the book value, but also current market value, replacement cost, acquisition cost, as well as other factors. This brings me to the end of my portion of the presentation. I'll now hand you over to the moderator, Mr. Mara Roy.
Thank you so much, Melissa. So at this time, we will now break for about 10 minutes. We will put a timer up on the screen, so we will all work at the same time. And when we resume, we will continue on with the general handbooks and guidelines presentation. Thank you very much. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So as promised, before break, we will now be going into a presentation on the general handbooks and guidelines. This will be conducted by Devika Singh, our policy officer. Devika.
Thank you, Tamara. Good morning, everyone. So now that we have grounded ourselves with a good understanding of the difference that exists between the old and new public procurement, retention, and disposal of public property regimes, we want to take a look at the contents of the handbooks and guidelines that will support the achievements of the objects of the new Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act 2015. In the next few slides, we will discuss the following areas. 1, the legal structure and relevant sections of the Act. 2, we'll look at an understanding of the procurement house. 3, we'll take a look at the procedural forms and forms of contract. 4, we'll take a review of the comprehensive handbook. And 5, we'll then look at the special handbooks and guidelines. So let us first take a look at the legal structure. Public procurement, retention, and disposal of public property actions are grounded in the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act 2015, namely Section 6.1, which states, any procurement of goods, works, or services, or retention or disposal of public property that is not done in accordance with this Act, and any procurement contract or agreement that is not entered into in accordance with this Act shall be void and illegal. The Act also empowers the Office of Procurement Regulation to support the achievement of the objects of the Act. So in this regard, the OPR will issue regulations and has developed handbooks and guidelines for use by you, the public body. So we'll now take a closer look at the authority of the OPR as it relates to handbooks and guidelines issued by the OPR. So Section 13(1)(c) empowers the OPR to issue and review guidelines in relation to public procurement and retention and disposal of public property, including model guidelines for special guidelines under Section 31B and 54(1)(b). Section 13(1)(d) of the Act empowers the OPR to prepare, update, and issue model handbooks, specialized bidding documents, procedural forms, and relevant documents for use, as well as Section 13(1)(e) and (p), which enables the OPR to create and publish standard form contracts and approve each procuring entity's special guidelines and handbooks. Now we'll examine what are your responsibilities as the public body as it relates to the handbook and guidelines. So Section 30 and 54 of the Act mandates public bodies to comply with the guidelines issued by the OPR. So based on our discussion earlier about the new philosophical approaches, you may have recalled that the new paradigm recognizes that one size does not fit all. So accordingly, Section 32B and 54(2)(b) of the Act allows public bodies to identify exceptions to indicate exemptions where the general guidelines will not meet their organizational needs. So under these circumstances, sections 32B and 54.2B provides for public bodies to prepare special guidelines for procurement and disposal of public property for approval by the OPR. So we'll now examine and take a look at understanding the procurement house, which would include the handbooks and guidelines, procedural forms, and templates developed by the Office of Procurement Regulation. The house, which can also be found on the OPR's website, along with the various general guidelines, includes some work-in-progress documents which will shortly be uploaded onto our website. So now, to make the relevant general guidelines relatable, we have placed them within various sections of the procurement house, which are the rooftop, the foundation, the planning stage, the tendering stage, evaluation and award stage, the contract management stage, and retention and disposal stage. During the next few slides, we will identify each of the general guidelines associated with the different sections of the procurement house. Looking at the rooftop of the procurement house, you'll find the comprehensive handbook of the procurement retention and disposal of public property, the basic procurement handbook, as well as a general guideline for the preparation of special guidelines and handbooks for approval by the OPR. Turning to the foundation of the procurement house, you will find general guidelines such as the framework of internal control for procurement, the code of conduct for both public bodies and suppliers and contractors, general guidelines relating to sector-specific guidelines, example for health or local government. There's also a guideline relating to developing procurement capacity, developing the annual procurement performance report, as well as the whistleblowing and challenge proceedings guideline. Now we move to the 5 stages of the procurement process and look at the guidelines associated with each of these stages. Within the column of the first stage, which is the planning stage, you will find guidelines related to procurement planning, such as developing the annual procurement plan, portfolio management, category management, management of risk in procurement, guidelines identifying procurement methods and procedures, guidelines associated with developing specifications, sustainable procurement and sustainable development guideline, as well as the supply contract guideline. Within the column of the tendering stage of the procurement house, you will find guidelines with respect to pre-qualification and pre-selection, pre-qualification with regards to specialist consulting services, purchase requisitions, request for quotations, general guideline for invitation to bid, general guideline for request for proposals, guideline relating to electronic procurement, public-private partnership guideline, local industry development and local content guideline, as well as treatment of unsolicited proposal guideline. Now, if you require guidance on evaluation of bids and award, the following guidelines would be of use to you. The evaluation of bids and award of contract, negotiation in procurement, as well as the guideline detailing the standstill period. Looking at contract management guidelines, you will find management and monitoring of procurement contracts, the listing of contractors and suppliers guideline, as well as a guideline regarding recording, keeping, and maintenance of procurement files. And now lastly, the stage of retention and disposal of public property section. This contains guidelines such as the Handbook for Retention and Disposal of Public Property, as well as the Guideline on Retention and Disposal of Public Property. And just to reiterate, all these guidelines can be accessed via the OPR's website for your use. Now, in addition to the very detailed handbooks and guidelines, the OPR also has developed a number of procedural forms and templates to be used by you, the public body, in procurement, retention, and disposal of public property. So for procurement, you have the procurement notices, market research report, procurement strategy development form, tender evaluation report, supplier contractor performance appraisal form. And with regards to disposal, you have forms and templates regarding requests for asset disposal, inventory and inspection report, appraisal and valuation report, the disposal strategy development approval template. There's a summary report of approved disposal action. There's a form relating to transfer donation form, as well as a notice of rejection form. The OPR will also provide standard form contracts, which would include purchase orders, which will include as well general terms and conditions, goods and ancillary services, forms, consultancy services, framework agreements, and service level agreements. Now we'd like to focus on the comprehensive handbook on procurement, retention, and disposal of public property, which you may recall was placed in the rooftop of the procurement house. Now, as the name suggests, the comprehensive handbook incorporates all elements of procurement, retention, and disposal of public property in summary format and references the relevant general guidelines in relation to specific topics. The Comprehensive Handbook of Procurement, Retention, and Disposal of Public Property was developed in the form of an executive summary. It sets out, among other things, information on the legislative, regulatory, operational, and internal control frameworks for public procurement. It also includes information of the entire procurement cycle from the planning to contract management and closeout stage, as well as summary information on retention and disposal of public property. Now, more importantly, it references the general guidelines where more detailed information on important topics related to procurement, retention, and disposal of public property is provided. Additionally, and this may be of particular importance for you to note, the comprehensive handbook can be used as a model for public bodies in developing their special handbooks and guidelines. So at this point, I have come to the end of my presentation, and I will now hand you over to Ms. Joy Joseph-Lara, who will go through the next section of the presentation, which will focus on the special handbooks and guidelines.
Thank you, Devika. Good morning, everyone. Before we go into this section, I would just like to pose a question to you where you could post your responses in the chat. What are the 3 options or decisions available to public bodies when preparing their special handbooks and guidelines? So you can go ahead and type your responses now. I'll repeat the question. What are the 3 options or decisions available to public bodies when preparing their special handbooks and guidelines? You can type 1 or 2 options as well. I'll repeat the question one more time. What are the 3 options, or you can give 1 or 2, or decisions available to public bodies when preparing their special handbooks and guidelines? So I see we just have 2 responses. 1, you can adopt the handbook and the regulations on the OPR's website, and then the option as to apply its internal organization policies as applicable. So I would provide a response for you. Good responses so far, but I would elaborate. So the next slide would actually give you the answer as we go into this section on developing the special handbooks and guidelines. So now that you have a good understanding of the handbooks, guidelines, procedural forms and templates, as well as the various forms of contracts that are being issued by the Office of Procurement Regulation, as presented by my colleagues before, let us discuss how you can move forward with your decision to either adopt the handbook and guidelines developed by the OPR, amend these general handbook and guidelines with exceptions and exemptions, or develop your own special handbook and guidelines. So this is the answer. Public bodies can choose to either adopt, amend, or develop their own special guidelines and handbooks. And so we now go through each of these options. Firstly, let's look at the option to adopt. It is important to note here that a number of public bodies have decided to adopt the general handbooks and guidelines issued by the OPR. If you would like to take this approach as well, you should write a letter to the OPR. We will provide you with a template for ease of reference. We will also suggest that you may wish to consider appending what is effectively a company profile to your letter. The company profile should provide background information on your organization, including who you are, how and when you were established, your location, one or multiple, and your functions, your annual budget allocation and the types of goods, works, and services you procure, your asset register, and any items of public property you may have for disposal. Following your submission, you will receive a letter of acknowledgement from the procurement regulator. Secondly, we look at the option to amend. Should you decide to pursue the amend option, you will be provided with an editable version of the handbooks and guidelines where you will track your changes utilizing the Track Changes feature in Microsoft Word to facilitate the review process. As such, you may wish to customize the handbook and brand it with your organization's logo and include, for example, your specific organization structure and internal control framework. You will also want to describe your unique set of circumstances in terms of special mandates, national security, commercial sensitivity, specialized operations, and unique market conditions. Additionally, you may want to provide information on innovative strategies developed over time that worked for your organization, ensuring that they allow promotion of the principles codified in the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act. Also, in respect of processes described in the general guidelines, you may wish to append your more detailed procedures for promoting the objects of the Act. Finally, we look at the option to develop. Should you decide that you wish to develop your own special handbooks and guidelines using ours as a guide, you will be required to 1. Identify the areas of similarity with the general guidelines and handbooks issued by the OPR, and 2. Identify areas of amendments, exceptions, and exemptions where the contents of your special guidelines and handbooks differ from the general guidelines and handbooks as issued by the OPR. Accordingly, care must be taken to ensure that your special handbook and guidelines is structured in line with the comprehensive handbook, taking into consideration the legal, regulatory, operational, and internal control frameworks, as well as the processes to be utilized in the procurement of goods, works, and services, and the retention and disposal of public property. I'd now like to go through the approval process if you decide to amend or develop your special handbook and guidelines. Upon receipt of your special handbook and guidelines, the OPR will conduct a comprehensive review of your submission, utilizing a checklist that contains all of the main and subheadings contained in the general guidelines and handbooks. If we identify areas for discussion or where we determine that additional clarification is required, we will contact the public body. The feedback stage may entail verbal discussions as well as written guidance from the OPR. Once the public body makes the required amendments to their special handbooks and guidelines, the OPR will review those amendments. Once satisfied that the public body's special handbooks and guidelines are in alignment with the principles contained in the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, the regulations, and the general guidelines, the procurement regulator will provide his approval to the special guidelines in written form. It is imperative to state here that in the event of an audit or investigation, your procurement, retention, and disposal of public property actions will be reviewed against the special guidelines and handbooks as approved by the OPR. This brings me to the end of this section on developing your special handbook and guidelines. Thank you. I now hand you over to Mr. Maravoy.
Thank you so much, Joy. So at this time, we will take another 10-minute break. We will place the timer again on the screen. So see you all back in 10. Okay, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So at this time, we will go into a presentation on some helpful pointers, and Ms. Pastora Brown will deliver this presentation. Pastora.
Thanks, Tamara. So good morning again, everyone. I promise this time to be very, very brief. I would have mentioned before that a number of public bodies have already submitted their draft procurement special guidelines and handbook for the OPR's review. However, as we all know, the regulations which will inform the information that goes into the guidelines have not yet been passed, and the section of the Act that allows the OPR to approve handbooks and guidelines have not yet been passed either. What we have done in the interim, that is both the Procurement Policy Development Department and the Disposal of Public Property Department of the OPR, is to review the documents that have been submitted by public bodies. Based on our review, we would like to share with you a couple of pointers you can take note of as you review and prepare your draft handbooks and guidelines. So the first one, we want to urge you to take time to understand the new philosophical approaches we shared with you here this morning, and the underlying differences between the old and new public procurement, retention, and disposal of public property regimes. Next pointer, ensure that your special guidelines and handbook cover all three functions. Let's not forget, we are no longer just focused on procurement, but also on retention and disposal of public property. Third pointer, remember to include your organizational structure as well as the details of your internal control system in your special handbook and guidelines. Number 4, remember to include how you intend to achieve the objects of the Act by promoting all 11 principles. So we tend to focus on accountability, integrity, transparency, and value for money. We have to remember that the new regulation also seeks to promote efficiency, fairness, equity, and public confidence, local industry development, sustainable procurement, and sustainable development. Number 5, be careful of your wording, your sentence construction, and your punctuation if you determine you wish to develop special handbooks and guidelines. You need to remember that the inclusion or exclusion of a word, for example, can change the meaning of a sentence. And we have to remember that the public body's actions will eventually be audited against your approved handbooks and guidelines. So if you have something in there that you did not intend, but that is what you have, that is what your actions will be audited against, or in the event of challenge proceedings to your procedures, those proceedings will be reviewing your approved guideline as you would have developed them. And number 6, last but not least, be careful to use standardized terms and definitions that are in alignment with those in the Act, the regulations, and in the glossary of terms, which we expect to have published on the OPR